Hi, everyone. It's Arry Yu, Chair of the U.S. Blockchain Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us. This one was a really interesting AMA. We had a IPFS versus Skynet from SIA kind of battle or debate or discussion. It was a suggestion provided from a community member, Marina, thought of it as a great topic for an AMA. And so threw that together, got two volunteers to join us. Thank you so much to be the debaters of IPFS versus CNET Skynet. And I learned so much, things that I didn't really realize. So I hope this was really meaningful and also helped you kind of figure out what's really means, because it helped me really figure it out. There's definitely a part two of this debate that needs to happen. I still haven't scheduled it, IPFS versus Skynet, but this is part one and it's very interesting and I hope you learn from it as much as I do. Don't forget, we have these AMAs every Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. You can sign up under the Blockchain Undergrad and it's a meetup group. Otherwise, myself and Steve, we teach a course called Bitcoin, Blockchain, and Crypto Fundamentals. It's an 8-hour course. We took a 12-week full-time course and boiled it down into 8 hours. We cover everything from blockchain, Bitcoin, Ethereum smart contract, OPSEC, identity, and IPFS basics. So if you want to learn and get everything that I've learned over the many, many, many years in this, and get all the best summaries, join us for a course. We have a bunch of cohorts coming up in September. All you have to do is sign up under this QR code right here for you. All right. Hope to see you in a future AMA and let us know if you have any questions or if we can help you with anything. Thank you. Bye. All right, let's kick it off. Hey, thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to be talking about IPFS versus Skynet today, and we have Rob and Alex to have joined us from the Facings.io team to help us learn more about IPFS versus Skynet. Really excited to learn about this because this is, I only knew about IPFS, so just knowing that there is something more than just IPFS, and we can have this conversation with Rob and Alex and the community that's shown up to ask questions will be really, really great. So let's kick it off. Let's have introductions. Rob, thank you for joining us. Can you give us a little bit about your background? What do you do? How did you get into the space? And, are you pro IPFS or Skynet? Which camp are you in? And then we'll ask the same questions to Alex to kick it off too.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks for having us on, Ari. Pleasure to be here. I'm Rob Konsdorf, founder at Facings and also DLT or Detroit Ledger Technologies. I've been working in blockchain, for ourselves since 2018. And before that though, worked as a software engineer and worked in various startups and on different, web technologies and backends and front ends and all kinds of development related stuff. So I bring that technology and software engineering perspective, and also sort of early view on crypto. I got into it about 9 years ago through some friends in college. And so in 2013, we were analyzing, buying Bitcoin for $100 or whatever. And none of us kept enough, of course, through that, but it was just a lot of fun. And got involved and fell down the rabbit hole with some different projects back then that are lesser known and not as prominent anymore, but were stepping stones leading us into sort of the maturing Web3 ecosystem that we have today. And I'll leave it there and pass it over to Alex. Or wait, you asked me a few more questions. So am I pro IPFS or Skynet? Yeah. And why? Well, I've never actually used Skynet, but I have used IPFS a lot. Mm-hmm. And I see that type of tool is super useful. So I'm glad to see there's different approaches trying to solve it, that competition and that sort of different approach will allow us to see more experiments. So I know a third one even that I think does similar things is called Arweave, from what I'm told. And I haven't done my research on these too deeply, but yeah, I do think having this sort of robust decentralized content addressing. So we can put information in NFTs that we can trust will resolve back to the same piece of media. That prevents, the NFTs media from being rug pulled, essentially, using IPFS as a linkage. So that's super useful, and I bet there's a lot of other useful use cases for storage too, outside of just that. But that's the perspective I've used it in and seen it very useful.
Cool. Thank you so much, Rob, for your background. I mean, 2013, that's really early. Wow. Alex, welcome to our AMA. Would you give your background introduction? How'd you get into this space and all that good stuff? Alex, are you here?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I got in a little bit later. I mean, I had heard about Bitcoin from some friends who were involved much earlier, kind of around Rob's time, but I didn't really pay too much attention until about 2016, and I downloaded either Mist or my Ether wallet, one of the two, but it was really buggy and it would take forever to sync. I remember that was like my first foray to like trying to just have my wallet. It would just like load for like almost like 2-3 days, maybe a week for me to fully sync up. And that was just because I didn't really do enough research. I just downloaded the first thing I looked up. But then eventually I started to get more involved and I played on exchanges, realized I could never trade. And so I was like, okay, what's going on behind the scenes? And I just really, it appealed to my tinkerer mind to just kind of like open the repositories on GitHub and explore the different philosophies behind like networks and consensus. And so it really stepped up my self-education and technical journey just by exploring these
Wow,
networks. So.
amazing. And then are you like so it looks like Rob is going to be more of the IPFS expert. Are you more of the Skynet expert then?
I wouldn't say that I'm like a Skynet expert. I'm a Skynet user that like I've been using it since I first read their announcement. And I just kind of used it as like a pseudo WeTransfer for a lot of people. Like I would just be like, okay, this is something I could quickly share a link that I know will expire, because I would never sign up with it. I've since signed up through one of the portals, and we'll get into the differentiation. But basically, in CS, the Skynet portal is the same thing as an IPFS gateway. So I've signed up with a service provider and enjoyed the really great storage benefits of having CS Skynet in my repertoire, but I don't know much about SIA, the underlying network, which is fascinating in the foundation's deployment. Like they've really created a great service layer that keeps us away from having to worry about the technical side of the SIA network and just enjoy like competitive storage pricing, which is awesome. It's really cool stuff to me.
Storage. All right. So like just in terms of definitions, what I've looked up some definitions around like what is IPFS versus what is Skynet. So I'll read the definitions, and then if you could help me, because you have the actual their information and experience with working with these products, help me understand what I'm missing. So what is IPFS? IPFS stands for Interplanetary File System, which I think is the coolest naming convention ever. And it is a decentralized way of storing documents and data created by Protocol Labs. That's it. Okay.
Yeah. So do you know, like BitTorrent, for instance?
Yes.
Torrent networks, how people could use peer-to-peer networks to connect to each other and transfer files, basically, and share data that way. So that peer-to-peer network concept is key here. IPFS is a peer-to-peer network as well, but it's a peer-to-peer network of IPFS nodes. And so those IPFS nodes are connected to each other and able to look up where content is being stored. So different media or files based off that hash you see. If you've ever seen a IPFS hash, it's like a 36 or some odd character long randomized string. So that you feed that into a node, and if it doesn't have the file pin
Mm-hmm.
it'll go out to the greater network and say, hey, who's got this file? Where is it? And then it uses, so not every IPFS node duplicates all of the data in IPFS. Nodes decide which data they're pinning. And that's why you pay, perhaps if you're using IPFS commercially, you might pay something like Pinata.cloud, which is a IPFS service that some NFT projects use, including us. And then, or maybe, you're more sophisticated in running your own IPFS nodes and you have more of a custom decision on what you're going to pin. But yeah, if it's not pinned, I guess it would sort of not be there anymore. But because the address to that content in IPFS is based off the file content, if you take the same file and pin it later, it'll generate the same IPFS hash. And that's why that's good for things like NFTs. Because it gives us resiliency to know the data inside this NFT isn't going to break later. It's not a brittle link like a URL that for a website that could go down or something. And then once that's down, I can't load the image anymore. And now I have a problem because my NFT is basically an image.
Right.
And I can't load it anymore. So yeah, so that's why it's really powerful there. But I'll pass it off for Alex.
Yeah, I have a definition for Skynet. So a Skynet is another form of decentralized information storage system, which is named after the AI in Terminator, which is really, everyone's like, Skynet, Terminator? No. It was created by Nebulous. And then there's a giant explanation about how it actually works. So it builds a blockchain that offers rewards for users for signing up to lend space on their hard drives to users on the blockchain. This lend space is then used to store the data, which is much easier to access than heading to a website of a company. Oh, yep, he gets muted. Then users can upload information to the blockchain and then share the associated link with anyone, just like Alex was talking about. The person then can access this link, can access information, even if they aren't operating a node. And then they simply pay a small amount of crypto, a coin, in order to process the transaction. So it sounds like it's still related to information storage. But is it less permanent than IPFS? Because IPFS, you can manage the permanence of the data that's being pinned or unpinned, right? From what I understand, Alex?
Well, okay, so at that point, it becomes a measure of how many nodes exist on the network, in my opinion, because it's like, how much failover do you have? And so also the Skynet, like it's taking advantage of the underlying SIA protocol, but it really doesn't force you to have to worry about paying via the network token, depending on what portal or the service providers have chosen to. And that's one cool thing. Some service providers, of course, offer a free tier and then will have you pay in fiat, and they're basically offsetting your exposure to the network rules with their own service layer that's also taking advantage of the SIA's protocol benefits for them renting out or leasing their storage space to the network. But what's also cool is that they have an incentive layer for speed and latency too, and they build both of those in to where it's more focused on content distribution versus the pure permanence of the file. I think in like mission of because it seemed like IPFS was also trying to solve extended distances and sharing data. Like in its namesake, like eventually we might have mesh networks extended beyond the terrestrial like hemisphere. So by having this peer over time seeded network layer, we could share information potentially, maybe line of sight. I don't know. This is getting very kind of spacey, but it seemed like the mission of IPFS was to evolve as a protocol first and foremost, versus SIA itself is showing one layer that you can provide I guess a service that doesn't require any sort of technical knowledge to interface with, because you can just use Skynet for, basic cloud storage, or also for NFT too. But the provider I use gives 100 gigs for free, and I find it very fair for just intro, especially these days with looking at the rates. I'm even looking at the pricing between Pinata and just the Skynet free, which is siasky.net.
Mhm.
They're, yeah, it's 1 terabyte is $5 a month for this provider, versus Pinata is looks like it's, how much do you get for $20?
So
100 gigs.
So
So
Skynet is on SIA. Isn't like SIA is to IPFS as Skynet is to, say, like Filecoin on IPFS? Is that a good analogy, would you say?
I think there's a big difference there, actually, Ari, because IPFS doesn't use a blockchain underneath it, but SIA is a blockchain. And then SIA Skynet is built on top of that blockchain, from my understanding. Whereas IPFS, it's a peer-to-peer network. So blockchains are also a different kind of peer-to-peer network, just like BitTorrent is a different kind of peer-to-peer network. So it's nodes connecting directly with each other. And but IPFS doesn't have a blockchain element to it, which is really more about how the database is structured, or like on that ledger. That's kind of like the database behind the ledger is really what the blockchain part of it is. But when we have a blockchain network, whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, or many others, they have, a networking component, and then they have their own like data component too. So they're complex projects that have different kind of layers in their code. So yeah, just to be clear, Filecoin, I know that's a thing, but you don't have to use Filecoin to interact with IPFS.
That's true.
So maybe that's like another service provider and also has a token element to it.
Right.
But you could use IPFS directly without and go around that. Whereas I feel like with SIA, that whole economic model is based around there's blockchain that's optimized for storage, using this token in order to access that storage. So there's like pretty different in design.
So maybe IPFS is like Wikipedia. It's, for the common good of all, and sort of like this peer-to-peer sharing ecosystem, but Skynet was designed with incentives built in. And so you can incent the experience to have faster downloads or bigger downloads or something like that. Am I getting it?
Or running like simple front ends, it's like another way of just running a distributed front end. Like, for example, Compound hosts a lot of their front ends on IPFS, so you could have a failover on Skynet and know that the portal that you're using, just like an IPFS gateway, they're incentivized to host your data through either your service agreement or for the network rewards. It's just another redundancy that you can build, lightweight client side stuff. If you're going to have something that's going to make requests on the server side, you're still going to then have your centralization issues, because you're going to have to make a call from that point outside of the either IPFS or Skynet portal. So it's really, it's cool if you're building something that can talk to a blockchain and give you buttons to talk to a smart contract. It's great. Because you can quickly spin up something that's very lightweight and portable.
Interesting. Rob also wrote, IPFS is a peer-to-peer network that lets you pin, aka store, files on the IPFS nodes, and they can talk to each other to find where the file is stored across the whole network of IPFS nodes. Unlike traditional web, which is address-based URLs to files, IPFS is address-based on the content being hashed, which gives it useful properties. It's a mouthful.
Sorry about that. I just saw there was some questions, so I figured I'd try to answer there.
Oh, that's very, very helpful. Well, I'm going to open it up to the community for questions because I think they're far more talented and technical folks than I am here. Who wants to start it off with questions? You can, come off mute and ideally onto video, ask questions, or pop it into the chat.
I know there's a few questions up higher, I think. Bridget's asked to explain rug pull at some point. So that's pretty much like when a project kind of promotes a false roadmap in order to get people to put money in, and then usually they're anonymous and they take the money and run and just sort of stop maintaining the project. So that's the most common definition. When I used it earlier, though, I was talking about having your NFT content stop loading. So like, it's not the same as necessarily a project maliciously running away with your money, but rather the NFT somehow got broke because the link to it was a URL. And so that's why IPFS is useful. We don't put a URL in. So if mywebsite.com stops loading in 2 years, the media isn't affected. That NFT, it gives the NFT more of a long life, having the content on IPFS, because as long as the file stays pinned on IPFS, which is a big if, someone still has to pay for that. How do we keep that going? If I stop paying our Pinata bill and all of the content for the IPFS or the files facings published as NFTs, we've helped publish over 700,000 NFTs on Wax. And they all have IPFS links in all of them, or hashes. Then perhaps Pinata would stop loading those files. However, I believe there's other service providers that are duplicating all of the IPFS hashes that are published to Wax. So because they would have the same file pinned, there's no service disruption because the hash still loads. When someone goes to the IPFS network with the hash and says, please give me the file for this, they still get a response, even if it's from a different node that pinned it. Really? So it gives us resiliency in our NFT content in that respect.
Does government use IPFS for like all the government documents? And I mean, is IPFS?
Wouldn't that be cool? Because it's public. It's anything you put on IPFS is public. So that'd be great for public data to have it duplicated to IPFS. And as Alex said earlier, you can actually store a statically hosted website in IPFS. So I know Wax has a few projects that they load. If you load their worker proposal system called Wax Labs, or some other election portal they have for the network, it actually in the back end takes an IPFS hash, loads the whole blob of all the website files, or well, it's compressed down into one file. So it loads that file and just runs it. And that's how the website's served. So that's kind of cool too, to give web code more resiliency too, by having it just be loaded, the whole website's code loaded up to IPFS.
It seems
so as long as you have the proper hash, you have access through any of those nodes because it's all shared, correct?
Proper hash, 1, and then 2, a node has to still be pinning it. So someone has to keep paying for that storage. So that's where things like Filecoin comes in. So my guess is Filecoin is an incentive framework to attempt to align the interests of all the participants in IPFS to keep it sustainable long term. That'd be my guess, but I haven't studied it deeply. Because you want to make sure stuff stays pinned that's important. Maybe it's okay to throw stuff away that was junk files how do we know who cares about what and make sure it stays pinned for a long time? And that's what blockchains give us, right? So SIA probably has their answer to that through a blockchain, because they can create an incentive structure that, you know, may at some level even operate like a DAO, DAO. Anyways, I know Bridget has her hand up.
Yeah, Brigitte, a question?
Hi, Rob. Thanks so much. I really appreciate that detailed explanation. I'm in healthcare, so work along exciting paths, hopefully, for blockchain to solve some of the interoperability problems. But we all assume the data is not going to sit on the chain. It's going to sit in some other file system. So do we have that file system yet? Is it either of the ones that we're talking about here, IPFS or Skynet? Or where do you see the ideal sort of technology for that use case of individuals, you and I, managing and controlling our own personal health data?
Thank you. That's a great question, Bridget. Good to meet you. Yeah, on that front, it's complex because of the regulations around privacy, and HIPAA being like the big law in the United States that manages that, right?
HIPAA does not apply to individuals. It only applies.
Oh, it doesn't?
No, it only applies to what are they called? Covered entities. So things that bill for on our behalf and others. So service providers, it applies to. We as individuals actually are not bound by HIPAA. We have the luxury to do whatever we want with our data at any time. Our problem currently, of course, getting the data, but assuming
you're saying like opting in, so everyone opts, people who want to opt in,
right? And now
to,
what,
like, using the system? Yeah, so here's the main concerns. Like, you're right, blockchain storage is expensive, so we don't want to get into the habit of storing things we don't need there, just the most critical data. And then where could we put something like you know, this? Well, that's a good question. You know, Alex may have greater ideas, but one, I can tell you a couple of things that I think you need. You know, so you can't just throw it out on IPFS, because IPFS is totally public, and you want access control around that health data, because the idea, I'm presuming, is to give the individual the data sovereignty, the ability to say, I want to allow this person to see my records, and only these three and my family, or however. So if you're putting it in any sort of public database, it's going to have to be encrypted, but you're still taking risk, because if the encryption's ever undermined and that data is public, and especially in any sort of public replicated database where there's 1,000+ copies of it now, it's going to be impossible to ever, you know, take that back. It's leaked if the encryption gets undermined. So that's where having a more traditional private storage solution probably still makes sense. But then, you know, yeah, we want to use like Web3 to give people power instead of companies, right? Because if you do it that old-fashioned Web2 way, then you got a company in the middle monetizing your data or whatever the deal is, you know, probably. So yeah, it is tricky. There's probably more, you know, I would say follow up is more research to see if you can find some sort of layer like that. And maybe that's being worked on already, and we don't know about it here on the call yet, or you know, options potentially. But
yes,
yeah,
it's
a good question.
We're not there yet. Okay, great.
Well,
thank you so much.
There is one thing though, at least with how SIA, the protocol functions, not all of the nodes receive the entire copy of the data that they are mirroring. And so that plus their encryption philosophy. But again, I'm just a user of Skynet, the more file storage end user. I'm not a participant and active user or node runner of the SIA protocol, but I do remember, and I've been reading the docs more recently, that part of their solution versus IPFS is that when you're saving and storing the data to them, not all of the nodes are being trusted with the entirety of the data, and it is still encrypted too. So they're really are forward thinking with not trying to just reinvent the IPFS wheel with like a token attached to it. It's just that there's so many different layers to it to really dive into. And then for your use case, it sounds like there's, you know, a lot of obfuscation that you're going to have to consider too, if you're going to try and employ any sort of like public ledger technology. Because I imagine that encryption is going to be one thing, but also just how do you hide something that's public in plain sight, so to speak. But yeah,
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, appreciate that.
Thank you, Brigitta. Marina, you have a question. Marina, you there?
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. I just talked. Shockingly, I don't have a question for a change for the first time in your life, Ari. I have a proposition to make.
Oh,
I'm wondering if it would be possible to have each one of the three now, and not just two, including not Arvin, but I forgot the name of the third one.
are we?
Yeah, if we can't get them all on the same day, but maybe having at least one of the founders of each here, and have Alex and Rob asking them questions in lieu of looking for differences between three of them.
So have like the founder, I mean, who is the founder of IPFS, Protocol Labs? So have someone from Protocol Labs there.
Yeah, somebody from Protocol Labs.
I think his name's Juan.
Yeah, maybe have one here, and Rob and Alex ask, nothing against you. I love you dearly. You know that, right?
Yeah. So,
but for obvious reasons, I have Rob and Alice asking him questions in lieu of looking for differences. Because if tomorrow you have a website and you want to host it on one of them, how do you make a decision? Where do you host it? What is the decision based on? And then maybe we can also answer all those probable that we were not sure of, that I think are important on the long run.
Because like today, most people just host their websites on normal like Amazon Web Services and Square.com and those sorts of sites, right?
But if we ever want to move towards decentralized, where nobody can take your website down,
or censor you, or
differences to make a decision where to host it, right?
Yeah. So then now the question is, where should the future decentralized Web3 person host their website? On IPFS, Skynet, or Arweave?
Yes.
And you don't know.
How do you make a decision, and what criteria do you use, and what may be questions? I would love to see. Alex said he posted some kind of a picture, but I don't know where.
I think.
Oh, here, I can post it again. It's the JPEG in the chat. Actually, it's a little bit further
I
up.
don't see a JPEG in a chart. I'm sorry, but that type of a thing, if if we can extract from each founder, maybe have like 3 different sessions on it. I don't know, in September, whenever you get a chance to, and again, have Alex and Rob ask them questions.
Yeah, Alex and Rob, you want to come back later and help ask questions?
Yeah, always down. Sounds fun.
But in the meantime, Rob is using IPFS to host these NFTs and publish his site.
Rob ask them questions.
Yes, we have done both, or assisted in the publishing of sites at least.
On both?
Yeah, Adam brought up some things in the chat too. Sorry, Ari.
No, go ahead.
Oh, he was bringing up naming systems. So there's tangential topic to IPFS, IPNS.
What's that? What is IPNS?
I gotta guess it's Interplanetary Naming System. That's what it stands for, but I've never actually looked that up.
Okay.
And then I guess Skylink has a comparable thing that Alex brought up, but essentially those are similar to what we were talking about with IPFS. Well, I can speak to IPNS a little bit. What it lets you do is reference something by name that's uploaded to IPFS. You can like upload a whole folder structure, for instance. So if you wanted to upload like, 100 things at once and they were all by name and you wanted to refer to them through IPFS by name instead of the hashes we were talking about earlier, you can do that. And there's a side effect in that it's easier to swap the data for those that are linked by name on IPFS using IPNS. So if you have NFTs where you want the images to change due to perhaps some external stimuli, or you can kind of program in different ways to change the media is. So you could theoretically make an NFT that swap an image every hour based on the time of day it is in a certain time zone or something like that. But that's one thing that you can't do that with IPFS in the same way you can do it with IPNS. And I think, so that could be for better or for worse. If you want something to be more hardy, just use a regular IPFS hash. If you have those specific needs in launching your NFT project, you might find IPNS. IPNS, I said it right. More useful. So anywho, just felt.
So do most of these NFT platforms use IPFS or Skynet, like OpenSea and these sorts of NFT platforms use IPFS? Or, I mean, you use IPFS, so why did you choose to use IPFS versus these other
Great question.
platforms? Yeah.
So in the Wax NFT ecosystem, there's the main NFT standard, kind of like the ERC 721 for the Wax blockchain, is called atomic assets. And in atomic assets design, it's become a standard in the ecosystem for everyone to refer to media through IPFS links. So then all of the sites that integrate with Wax NFTs can use that standard to load the data. Now, there are some drawbacks. IPFS is slower and there's certain drawbacks to it that still need to be improved on. But it does give us a huge amount of resiliency to these NFTs. Whereas, it's possible to create an NFT on Ethereum that is using a static link, like a website URL that could go down in the future to load content. And when you do that, you have that ability. You're relying on centralized hosting again, whoever's hosting that regular website that's loading the data. And so there are definitely initiatives and projects thinking or attempting to make it those ETH NFTs more reliable by design as well. And leveraging IPFS is a clear winner. If you can shove that in somewhere and build a standard where all of the websites read from that now instead of the old way, then we're on track. But I honestly don't know where that stands in the ETH ecosystem. And then I know for the longest time, and I'm not sure if this changed, Flow NFTs also referred to media not through IPFS, but on centralized hosting. And so they had that same vulnerability at the end of the day, or lack of resiliency, I would say. It's not a security vulnerability, but now you're relying on another single point of failure.
Yeah.
So if you're after a more robust decentralized solution, you need to get rid of that single point of failure, ideally, or that it'd be good to work towards getting rid of that.
Interesting. So I was part of the 2017 ICO world, and a couple of years later, going back into looking for the old white papers and websites, they no longer exist. Or you can't find them using Google search or Bing search, whatever your search preferences. And so, like, if back in the day in 2017, all these ICOs had put their website on IPFS and had put their white papers on IPFS and pinned it, those artifacts and accoutrements of the ICO world would still exist. Is that correct?
Yes, that's actually great. A lot of those promises perhaps made could be referred back to.
Right.
Yeah, and theoretically, so long as they couldn't just take down the pins and nobody replicated them, you'd still need other nodes in IPFS to pin. And yeah, so one thing I've thought about a lot is like, okay, so how can we ensure that there's always a lot of pinning, or that all of the content we care about is pinned in a more robust, decentralized way,
or how do you
rather than
how do you incent people to take your pin and replicate across more than one other node? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah. So on Wax, this is a theoretical project that we could try to do. The network is run by paid service providers that are generally small teams called guilds or block producers. If you've ever heard of the EOS network or Telos network, Wax functions very similarly. So you could try to create a cultural shift in those guilds to, especially if the prices are good and they're getting paid well, you could say, hey, all the guilds that run, this additional service layer, and throws, storage resources at pinning everything on the node. Basically, if we made it a responsibility of the people who are running the blockchain and getting paid through inflation already to also pin every piece of content on the chain. So from the beginning of the history, when the blockchain started, just every single IPFS is constantly pinned. You'd have at least 21 replications across those companies. And then every other node that isn't in the top 21 could also perhaps be doing this as well to try to compete and become part of the top 21, which is done through stake weighted voting. So it's kind of like a big DAO. Choosing who runs the blockchain. It's kind of meta, but that was my thought, was like, hey, this is ever a problem, or why don't we just work towards that, where we add it to their plate, because then we always know there's at least usually at least like 50 companies on each of these networks attempting to compete as a block producer. So now you've got a bunch of replications and the inflation's paying for it. So it's kind of more self-sustaining.
Right.
The block rewards,
But to any Joe Schmo who's not as technically savvy as yourself or Alex, and they want to put up a website and we want it to be decentralized and we want to embrace this whole Web3 ethos, then this should automatically be done by default, right? Like I
click two buttons and you can do it.
Yes, and I'd like this to be permanent, and I don't care if it's going to be Wax blockchain versus Ethereum versus, other blockchains. I mean, we're not even close to that right now, right?
Yeah, and I mean, theoretically, you could not even involve a blockchain. If it's not, I keep talking about Wax because Facing's focuses on NFTs. So I'm constantly thinking about those use cases. But like you were saying, the use case of storing a website on IPFS since IPFS isn't a blockchain, we don't even have to touch a blockchain. We could try to go straight for that. So that's a really good question. Is there anyone out there that just lets you do that in 2 clicks or makes it really easy yet? Because that'd be a worthwhile project to facilitate. And at the end of the day, even though the site is stored on IPFS for the ones I mentioned earlier, they still relied on either Cloudflare or AWS to do some little bits of work. So it wasn't a full solution where you didn't have those extra dependencies. It gave you an extra level of resiliency, or those websites. But yeah, they still needed those other centralized pieces of infrastructure to complete the cycle. So that still wasn't, you know, that isn't the full vision I think you're talking about.
And then for NFT users, you know, like people like the idea of NFTs because they're unique, but then also they have this idea of permanence, right? And so if I buy an NFT from OpenSea, I mean, I saw this one product recently where it was like this universal wallet. It could work with any blockchain, and you could have NFTs from any blockchain, and you could host it in this one wallet experience along with your other tokens and cryptocurrencies and ERC 720, not 720s, ERC 20s. Is that the experience that most NFT users have, or are most NFTs locked into that particular blockchain's NFT world that they've purchased today?
I think that we will continue to see interoperability as a goal, because the blockchains are really dynamic from an economics perspective. You know, a lot of them, the fees are always fluctuating. Even if you have a feeless system, you know, there's still resource challenges somewhere. You know, there's some dynamic thing depending on usage. So because blockchains are really, really slow, really, really expensive public databases, we're going to need more of them if like the whole world's moving on to this, or we're going to have to make them way more incredibly like order of magnitudes cheaper than they currently are through innovation. So I believe, you know, multiple blockchains is going to be an inevitability, because one blockchain becomes way too hot, it's the happening spot, all of a sudden it's super expensive and you priced out a bunch of people. If I gotta pay 15 or 20 or 30 bucks or whatever the current gas fee is every time I want to do one thing,
right,
I can't. There's a lot of people in the world that can't participate in that. So yeah, I personally believe there's going to be a lot of blockchain, you know, maybe some are niched in and just backing one app, or maybe they all roll up into, you know, core systems like people kind of envision with like maybe Ethereum's future or other core protocols futures. We talk a lot about something called horizontal scaling in Wax, because Wax has like 15 million transactions per day, roughly. It's the most active blockchain just by sheer transactions. And most of those transactions are games, people playing games that don't have any much financial value. It's just data on a blockchain related to a smart contract game. And so that's why there's like a lot more. It's not a ton of value slosh around. Or NFT trades, that's another huge source of Wax traffic. But you know, I don't have the user numbers directly in front of me, but let's just say they had 100,000 users and they were generating 15 million transactions per day.
wow.
And that in combination to the world population, is still like 5 orders of magnitude under the total population of humans. Right. So let's just assume like 10% of humans get in. We're still like 4 orders of magnitude away from scaling or we need to scale up 4 orders of magnitude from where we are today. And that's on the most active blockchain using one of the most performant protocols that has decentralization trade-offs. You know, that's what Wax and these other, that's my expertise. That's why I'm talking about it, just to be fully transparent. You know, I work on those systems. But I guess the point that I was going for is there's just a lot of work to be done. Oh yeah, horizontal scaling. So the thought is, in the future, what if when an app gets really big, it has its own blockchain, but that blockchain rolls up into the token of a different blockchain. So you could have Wax blockchain, and then Alien Worlds and Splinterlands and all these big Wax games that are popular have their own chains that run their own workloads off them, and they roll back up to this core. So creating like an interoperability and also being able to use that as a scaling concept for, you know, at least getting another 1 or 2 orders of magnitude closer to maybe saturation of blockchain usage globally, which will take a long time. But, you know, if we want to get there, there's massive hurdles, and, you know, hopefully the innovation keeps up, and we see, you know, waves of people being able to unlock value and participate.
Cool. For that, Rob. Marina has a hand up. Marina, it looks like you've also posted some more information and data on SIA Coin versus R-Wave and some analysis on it.
I'm sorry, I did not lower my hand last time. I'm still trying to look for deltas, and I'm trying to understand the differences, because that's how I understand the world in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, the stuff that you posted is really interesting. So R-Weave is generally better than SIA Coin in terms of utility and probably would maintain its edge well in the future. Yet R-Wave is used relatively less in transactions, probably because SIA Coin has been around longer. SIA Coin has been around, is 300 times cheaper to send than R-Weave, but SIA Coin's transactions are about as equal or slower to confirm. SIA Coin is 3 times more decentralized, allowing SIA Coin to probably be more trustworthy and probably more secure. SIA Coin's utility is not as good as R-Wave's and is expected to maintain its relative utility, lower utility for the foreseeable future. Despite this, SIA Coin is used relatively more in transactions, likely because it's relatively older. SIA Coin's utility, its market cap is 170 million euros, which indicates it's undervalued compared to R-Wave's market cap, which is 387 million euros. And IPFS is not in this market cap world, so we don't really have a comparable for IPFS unless we're looking at Filecoin, right? But I guess the real question, maybe like the next debate, should be really around, hey, let's have a conversation around how do we get to a decentralized web where things are not as hackable and also censorable, and, you know, people can decide what stays on the web or doesn't stay on the web. Is that the right question?
So my question to you is, tomorrow you're trying to do consultancy. Tomorrow you have a company that comes in and says, we want to host it in decentralized environment. Which of the 3 do we choose? What are you going to tell them?
There's pros and cons to everything. You can look at R-Weave versus SIA Skywave, Skynet, or IPFS. Right? Rob, Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely like, it really is application specific. There's going to be trade-offs. If I was just looking at it from like a risk off point of view, there's just far greater nodes running on IPFS than any of these other nodes. Like I'll drop some more links. I'm sorry to just keep flooding these links in the chat, but I have a bunch of stuff that I was just kind of curating, and you know, I was comparing the nodes that I can see that we're running specifically Skynet portals, because see, Skynet is again the CDN that's on top of SIA. So if we don't want to have to run an interface with a blockchain, then we're trusting not only the SIA nodes to provide the data, but the Skynet portal providers too, just like an IPFS gateway works. So you've got we can look at the list here, but you know, you've only got like maybe like 40, 50 Skynet portals with 600 SIA nodes that I can see that are online, versus IPFS is dramatically more adopted, you know, over maybe like 100,000 nodes, I'd say, but
Wow.
I'll let Rob kind of confirm on that. But yeah, I mean, it's just, it's dramatically, so if we were just talking about risk and like, okay, just suddenly there not being any peers to serve the data, assuming you don't want to run a node yourself, IPFS has definitely got the advantage here versus all of them.
Can I ask a little clarification for what you just said?
Yeah.
Because the first thing you said, it depends on application. Can you give me an example of application that takes into account the fact of securities that you just spoke about for the last few minutes, that you would still choose to host on on Skynet instead of IPFS?
Sure. So there is something that is emergent in, I think, more DeFi that I've noticed, but it's going to start popping up, where there's decentralized front ends. So people are creating front ends to address the same smart contracts, and those front ends are allowing the host or the maintainer to affix their own fee upon you interacting with the smart contract, or applying some service layer to it, so that projects can release contracts but not be held liable to providing front end access to maybe financial instruments that could be banned in some regions that are not banned in others. But DeFi projects don't want to have to do geo blocking. Anyways, that was the first thing that was coming to my mind, is something that SIA, Skynet, and some of these other protocol storage solutions aren't going to ask you for an account sign up. Now, the portal service providers will in some cases, but if you were to build it completely in a trustless, no contact way, that might be one of the applications for them. And I'm just trying to play devil's advocate and think of like very, very specific use cases. And this is also for censorship resistance too. There might be, you know, dissemination of information that perhaps might be banned in some places that people want to mirror, and they can pay for that information to be theoretically hosted for some time frame to then be mirrored and sent on. I'm just trying to spitball here. Sorry.
I'm sorry, and why would it be better for those to be hosted on Skynet than IPFS?
Just because, I mean, IPFS gateways that we use right now, they could still not serve the content. Like if Pinata or if Infura decided to not serve your CID, you would end up going back to just running your own IPFS client, and at that point you might run your own node. So I'm just thinking, if you're still trying to not run the service, pay for something, or employ something temporarily, you can still use Skynet.
Thank you.
Cool. Well,
It sounded like Skynet was cheaper too, wasn't it, Alex?
Right
When you
now, it appears
dropped the numbers earlier.
300 times. That's what's shocking to me.
Wow, that's huge.
Well, you know, that's why I've never heard anything compared to anything that is 300 times cheaper anywhere, never mind blockchain or anything in entire world.
well,
Right.
well,
I think
Oh,
they
man.
want to incentivize growth though that way. There's probably an agreement amongst the operators and the node providers to stay as competitive as they can while Pinata and Infura are scaling. Because I know Pinata just raised their rates, I think, on us, right, Rob? I don't know. It was like in the last
Sounded like that might have happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't looked super close yet.
okay, well, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Rob and Alex, for spending time with us and helping us get a little bit more insight into, you know, Skynet versus IPFS. And we'll try and continue the conversation. And if we get the next conversation going, we'd love to invite you again to help us sort through this world of Skynet versus IPFS versus Arweave. And thank you, Marina, for bringing up this idea. It looks like we've opened up a can of worms on lots of work that still needs to be done in this world, decentralized world. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Rob and Alex and Marina, and the the Facings team, and have a good weekend, everybody. Happy Friday. And don't forget, I think it's Father's Day this weekend, right? Yeah. Call your dad.
Yeah. Call your dad. Thank you for having us, Arry. It's been a pleasure. Looking forward to next time.
You're welcome. Happy Friday, everybody. Bye.
All right. Welcome to Windshield Time, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. This podcast is non-technical, fun, informative way to learn about money, Bitcoin, blockchains, crypto, and digital assets for busy parents and working folks who are curious about these new technologies. Day, Arry, and their guests talk about these evolutionary systems of money and what they do, y'all. Because what part of your life does money not touch? This podcast is not financial advice, and your reactions are your total and complete responsibility, y'all. Now, thanks again and enjoy the show.
Stuck inside.